Welcome to this exploration of 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. I'm going to be looking at 3.0 edition of Dungeons and Dragons, as you can see here with this lovely player's handbook from 3rd edition, released I believe August 2000. I will just mention that I really like this design style. This faux book style that was going on in 3rd edition, which slowly got phased out over the course of the edition, but this was very, very cool when I first saw it. The reason I'm doing this is that I currently play 1st edition Pathfinder with my gaming group, and I see a lot of problems with that game. Mostly it's good. There are elements of it that I enjoy, but it is basically a miniatures game. It requires playing on a grid with miniatures, either virtual or in person, in order to actually get through adventures. There's a lot of consideration of tactics and moving around the board, flanking, sneak attacks, spell areas, that sort of thing. The game is somewhat bloated, I would say. There's over 200 books, I believe, for Pathfinder 1st edition, all of which are available online, either on the Pathfinder SRD for free, or can be purchased as PDFs or obtained in a less legal fashion that some players like to do. I quite like to purchase the physical books. I think that that's the best way to play. And whether that's because I'm a bit of a Luddite, I'm not sure, but I like to have the actual product in my hand while I'm playing. There's something nice about flicking through the pages of a book. So the game appears to be very bloated with far too many options as far as I'm concerned. Speaking of that, I think that there is an issue with power creep, I believe the term is called, that is notable in role-playing games as well as card games like Magic the Gathering, where products need to be released at regular intervals, and in order to get somebody to purchase products which are not actually required to play, most of these role-playing games only require the core rulebook, and if you're a player, it's only one book. If you're a dungeon master, then it can be 3 books minimum, up to however many. So the producers of these books need to have some incentive for purchasing the new product, and that can be a new interesting mechanic, it can be new classes, new spells, new feats, but always something needs to be introduced. More often than not, those introductions create unbalance within the game. The newer classes will have something that makes them slightly superior to the older classes, and various feats or spells can be combined with this or that from other products to create more powerful things. And I suppose that's where the origin of the min-maxer or the power gamer comes from. So there is this idea within Pathfinder 1st edition, and I suppose may have been introduced in 3rd edition, of the build. Whenever I look online, people tend to describe their characters as a build rather than as a character. And I think that that's because of the huge amount of options that are available promotes this idea of optimization. I think that's a little bit out of the spirit of the game, but it's there now, and I'd like to see whereabouts that got introduced. So what was good about 3rd edition? That's what I'd like to explore, and I'd like to have a look at the differences between 3rd edition and 3.5 edition. There are some obvious changes that were made. Some of them seem to be very beneficial. the main culprit in 3rd edition was the Ranger, also the Monk, I believe. Both were made better in 3.5, which was probably a good idea. But we're just going to see how bad that they were originally in 3rd edition, if they were that bad at all. What are the best products in 3rd edition? I've played a few recently, converted to Pathfinder. For example, the Standing Stone. That was an adventure for 3rd edition. And I've played a bunch of Dragon Magazine adventures as well. So when was the, let's say, the downfall of 3rd edition? There was obviously a point where the system became incredibly bloated, and some of the things that were being released were bad. I think the Dungeon Survival Guide, I think that's what it's called, it was one of the last products released for 3rd edition, and it was, I think, unanimously considered as being a terrible book. But there were other books that were not particularly useful. Some of them that were really great and outstanding. So we're going to try and identify where those products are. And when did the game become a combat game? I've been playing a bunch of OSR games, mainly Dungeons and Dragons Basic, using the Rules Cyclopedia or Old School Essentials, for example. And that game is obviously much more simple. There's less options, but I think it promotes role-playing more and is more interesting and requires more thought while playing. But one of the benefits of it is that things can be thought up on the spot and implemented in the game very easily. Random tables play a much greater role, but those games can be played theatre of the mind entirely. One can use miniatures if one wants, but it's not required, and you can still get a good grasp of the combat without having a map with a grid. That is impossible with Pathfinder, and probably difficult with 3rd edition as well. Though I used to play 3rd edition without a map initially, though that changed later on. But there was a push in 3.5 certainly to get the encounters and the battle maps in the game. This probably coincided with the release of the miniatures, which, as far as I recall, looked terrible. They were pre-painted, flimsy plastic miniatures, and I think that they were not sold. You couldn't choose which miniatures you were buying. I think that you bought boxes of miniatures, and it was a sort of a random chance of what you got. There were different rarities of miniatures. It was very much going along with the model of Magic the Gathering, which was so successful in the early 2000s, that they wanted to apply the same sort of approach to the miniatures in Dungeons and Dragons. So, as part of pushing those miniatures, there was an increased focus on miniatures battles within the books. You got more and more encounter maps and all that sort of thing. So that was probably the origin. Although I think that miniatures were being produced for 3.0 as well. They reintroduced the chainmail line quite early on, I think, and certainly gridded combat is featured in this player's handbook, the 3.0 version. So I'd just like to see how far you can get Theatre of the Mind with 3rd edition. The fact that 3rd edition has the attack of opportunity, which I don't know if that was in 2nd edition or whether it's a 3rd edition thing, but attacks of opportunity are the main cause for relying on the grid, I think. So I'd also like to basically build some characters, run some adventures, and with those characters explore For example, the ranger and the monk, and the bard as well. Some of those weaker classes, according to the third edition, to just see how weak or how bad they might be in the game, and also take a look at some of the prestige classes. As when I used to play when I was younger, we didn't tend to use prestige classes very often. The players would generally pick one class and stick with that class until 20th level, which invariably we would never actually get to. I think 15th level was the highest that we ever got with one long campaign, but low level play has always been my interest. I think that the game kind of breaks down at around 8th to 10th level, but we'll see if that is truly the case, and whether that's something built into the game that it can't support higher levels, or whether it is just a preference of mine.